You're listening to Storytime in Paris on Paris Underground Radio. Since well before Victor Hugo looked up at Notre Dame and thought, what if a hunchback lived in there? Authors have been inspired by Paris. Welcome to the Storytime in Paris podcast on Paris Underground Radio, where we keep that tradition alive by showcasing an author with a French connection in each episode. Every episode will feature 5 questions asked by you, our author's biggest fans, and answered live on air. Then our authors will treat us to a reading of an excerpt from their book. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity. Would you like to join the Storytime in Paris book club? Head on over to patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio and stay tuned to the end of this episode for more information. My guest this week is award-winning author and cartoonist Adrienne Celt. Adrienne has written 3 books, including The Daughters, which won the 2015 Penn Southwest Book Award for Fiction and was named a Best Book of the Year by NPR. She's also won the O. Henry Prize and the Glenna Luschei Award for her writing. Adrienne's latest novel, End of the World House, is a mind-bending exploration of friendship and identity. When best friends Bertie and Kate head to Paris' Louvre for a last hurrah, Kate suddenly disappears, unleashing time loops and multiverses. But with this book, perhaps more than any other we've discussed on this podcast, it's important not to give anything else away. The magic of this novel is in its unfolding. So without further ado, please allow me to introduce Adrienne Celt, author of End of the World House. Welcome, Adrienne. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. I'm excited to be here.
It's very nice to speak with you. I really enjoyed your book. It was thoroughly unpredictable.
Thank you. That's great to hear, actually. I'm not sure it's what everyone is going for with their books, but I think with this one, I was trying to do something unusual and let the structure be part of the storytelling in a way that it's not always like visibly in a novel. So I'm glad that came across and you liked it.
It did, and it makes it very difficult to ask questions because I certainly don't want to give anything away because part of the magic of your book is the discovery of the world that we're in.
I think it can be said that there's a turn partway through the book that we will try not to spoil, but it's there, so look forward to it.
Exactly. So before we get too much further into this, can you tell us a little bit about you and your work?
Yeah, I'm a novelist. This is actually my End of the World House is my 3rd novel. My first was The Daughters, which is an operatic soprano with family ties to Poland, and her family left during World War II, and she's been raised with all of these beautiful stories about sort of mythological fairy tale stories about what Poland was like and what her grandmother's life was like there, because she's been sort of put aside by her mother, who is a jazz singer and has a much more realistic view. So it's about, family legacy and inherited trauma, but also the beauty of art and music and identity, and a deal with the devil.
Fabulous.
Yeah. And my second novel, Invitation to a Bonfire, came out in 2018. And that is inspired by the marriage of Vladimir and Vera Nabokov. And it's not about them. The characters are different. All the scenarios are invented, but it's sort of it's inflected with that rich voice. I love words. I love the sound of words. I love the rhythm and the music of them. So Nabokov is one of my favorite novelists, and that it was very fun to dive into the rich world of his sounds and make my own world out of it. And it's kind of I called it, when I was writing it, a sexy marriage murder mystery. Because it kind of is. And there's a love triangle, there's a murder that you know about at the beginning, and there are a lot of twists along the way. And actually that book is being made into a TV show for AMC television, so look for that in 2023.
That's so cool. Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited about it. It's been in the works for so long, and the fact that it's actually happening now is completely surreal.
That is so cool. And what about this book?
Oh, yes. And this book, An End of the World House, is the story of 2 best friends, Bertie and Kate. I wanted to write something more contemporary, especially after Invitation, which is set in the 20s and 30s. So Bertie and Kate are in a world that's a lot like ours, but it's kind of a sideways world. The geopolitically and environmentally, everything is just sort of falling apart at the seams. And they're in their own falling apart at the seams moment in their friendship, where Kate is about to move away from their shared home in the Bay Area, where Bertie works in tech and Kate works in nonprofits. And Bertie is having a really hard time with that. She is their friendship is kind of her whole world. And so they're on this trip to Paris together in order to sort of refresh their friendship and have a last adventure together before this big change. And they meet a mysterious man who gets them into the Louvre on the day that it's closed, so they can have a private tour of the Louvre. And they end up there a lot longer than they intended. That's where the time loop comes in. So it's looking at their friendship. It's looking at the feeling that we all get in so many parts of our life, of both whether within our friendship where we're not able to change, or within our day jobs where everything sort of feels like we're on a little hamster wheel and just you're seeing the same things over and over and over again. Also looking at the tech world in the Bay Area a lot, which it wouldn't sound like it since they're in the Louvre, but just trust me, it comes in. and just a lot of other things. But it was a really fun world to write in. Bertie is a cartoonist, so there are some illustrations in the finished book as well. And it was a very challenging revision process. Time books are not easy to write, but I had a lot of fun doing it, and I got very invested.
Fabulous. Can you tell us your connection to Paris or to France?
Yes. I mean, well, so obviously one connection is that the book is partially set there, but my father was actually born in Paris. And so he grew up in Munich. My family is Polish. My grandparents were both fighting with the resistance during World War II. My grandfather was a paratrooper for the Polish government in exile, a paratrooper and a courier. And so he survived 2 separate drops into occupied Warsaw. He was the only paratrooper to do so. And after the war, he and my grandmother both left Poland because it was occupied by the Soviets. And they moved to Munich and planned to move to America, but sort of never did, and ended up all around Europe for a while. So I always had a strong connection to Europe generally, and Paris particularly. And when I graduated from high school, my grandmother bought each of us, as we graduated, a Eurail pass so we could travel and see the world. And I went with my best friend at the time, who's still a close friend of mine. And so she was the first person I ever went to Paris with, and we went to the Louvre and did all of the Parisian things. And when I was writing and revising End of the World House, I went back. Actually, I told my husband, I'm going to go to Paris this was pre-pandemic, of course. I'm going to go to Paris to research this book I'm working on. I'm just going to go to the Louvre for a few days, and I'm going to write it off on our taxes, which is easier said than done. But that was what I told him. And he was like, you don't want me to come? And I was like, I guess you can come, sure. So we ended up doing a big trip, and the great part about it was, well, besides that it was just fabulous and we had a great time, my friend who was the first person I ever visited Paris with was living in London at the time, and she was able to come over and have dinner with us and go to some flea markets and stuff and just like have a day and bring it all, full circle while I was researching the book. So that was really special. And we stayed in the hotel that my grandmother and my dad had stayed in every time they visited Paris together, which is the Hôtel de Vendôme near the Pantheon.
Wow. It all comes together. And that reminds me, you were telling me a little bit about the origin of your last name too. And since you brought up your grandfather and your grandmother, perhaps you could share that?
Yeah. So a lot of people think it's pronounced Celt, but it's actually pronounced Celt. And it's an acronym. So it may have been one of his pseudonyms for some of his courier work during World War II, but it was certainly the name they used after the war. My grandfather's last name was Chuk, which I can barely pronounce because I don't speak Polish, which I'm very ashamed of, but it's true. And so he and my grandmother made this name for themselves to use in America that would be easier to use in America, and also as a pseudonym for his memoirs. So the C comes from Chuk, the E comes from my grandmother's name, Eva, The L comes from her maiden name, which was Lovell, and then the T is Tadeusz, which was my grandfather's name. So
So cool.
that's always been my name, and it's really special.
So I have gathered some questions for you.
Wonderful.
And the first one is this. So you are an author and a cartoonist.
Mm-hmm.
How does your cartooning influence your writing and vice versa?
That's a great question. So I would say in general, they are separate but complementary parts of my artistic process. My mother is a painter and an artist, and so I always that was always something that we did as kids growing up, drawing and painting. But it wasn't something that I felt. It wasn't something that I like committed myself to the same degree that I did with writing. I knew that I wanted to be a novelist, and I went to graduate school for creative writing. I was always writing stories, and it just I started to miss it a lot during graduate school and college too. I actually drew a comic in college for our school newspaper. And so it just became something that I was also committed to, that I was able to do and put out into the world without as much agita. I didn't have to workshop it. I didn't have to get anyone's opinion on it. And it became, especially my webcomic, Love Among the Lampreys, is something that I do more or less every week. I sometimes will take a week off for vacation, or if I just, can't get to it. But it's because it's this practice that I come back to every week. It doesn't matter to me so much if one comic isn't my favorite, because I know that there will always be more. And it allows me to sort of relax in a creative space in a different way than with writing. With writing, you're very immersed in the world. It sort of takes over your whole body. It takes over your mind. Everything you see becomes a connection to it. But with art, once you get the general sense of what you want it to do, it's really flowing out of you. And, you lose yourself in it. It doesn't have to be as conscious of a process. And so I find those two things to be really, really complementary, like I said. But End of the World House is the first book I ever actually drew illustrations for, because I made Bertie a cartoonist. And not only did I actually put illustrations into the book, while I was writing it, anytime I got stuck, but I didn't want to lose the headspace of the book, I would sketch, I would do watercolors of the characters or the scenes that I was working on. And that became really fun and special, and just a part of the whole process to me. Like, it's a sort of, now I have all of these paintings even of scenes that I've cut, so it almost feels like I have a view into another world, like another world's version of the book through those pictures.
Very cool.
Very meaningful if you've read the book.
Yeah, well, and the version, I have a galley version, so mine doesn't have the pictures. So without giving anything away, there are some cartoons that become quite important towards the end of the book. Are those in your copy?
They aren't. I tried not to do exactly the cartoons that Bertie would draw, because I didn't want to imply that the way I draw is necessarily the way that Bertie draws.
Interesting.
But there are a couple at the beginning, and then there's one in the middle. The one in the middle, I think, will be recognizable to readers as what you're talking about, a cartoon that becomes an important part of what Bertie does in the second half of the book. And the first two are just illustrations of scenes of Bertie and Kate in Paris, which will also, they definitely tie into the novel, and in some ways things that Bertie draws, but they're meant to be more in my own style.
Got it. So they're cartoons of them, not cartoons that Bertie has created.
Yes.
Have you always dreamed of owning a place in Paris? If you're planning on moving, renting, buying, or selling a place in France, you'll need the expert guidance of Gail Boisclair and Marie Pistinier, hosts of the Paris Estate of Mind podcast. Listen now to Paris Estate of Mind on parisundergroundradio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. So, End of the World House, which is a fabulous title, by the way.
Thank you.
It's really good. So this book is about a lot of things, but one of the central focuses is this relationship between Bertie, who's essentially the main character, and her best friend, Kate. And your book probes into that friendship a lot, talking about the ephemeral nature of friendship, but also the permanent imprint that it can make on our lives. But their friendship is not like a traditional cliched friendship. They're not like all sunshine and sisterhood, but they're also not like catty high schoolers. And Bertie refers, I think, affectionately to Kate as her best friend, the bitch.
Hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about how and why you constructed their friendship this way?
Yeah, I so there were characteristics of each of them that I wanted to bring to the fore, and one of them for Bertie, a lot of what is expressed through the structure of the book for her, which is also expressed through her attitude towards Kate, is her ability to kind of burrow into to her stuckness. Like the concept of being stuck in a situation even within your own head was really important to me for Bertie especially. So she I think she thinks that she has a very clear-eyed view of Kate, and she is sort of possessive of her in a way that has she's almost melded with her in her own mind. So, like you can call yourself a bitch, you can call your sister a bitch, you can call your best friend a bitch, and you can mean it nicely. So it's almost it's meant to show that there is this slippage between them in terms of where they stop getting polite and start getting real for those of us who came of age in the 90s.
Oh no.
And I know. and and Kate, I think, on the other hand, is more self-possessed and is more able to see herself as separate from Bertie in a way that I'm not sure she always realizes. I think she holds herself separately in a sort of self-protective way sometimes, which is probably healthy for them. I'm now psychoanalyzing my characters like I was giving them a therapy session. I think it probably does in many ways provide balance for them that Kate sort of pulls away and Bertie holds closer. But it also, of course, because it's opposing forces, creates a conflict, especially when they want something very different. So yeah, I wanted to show two people who have been and can be extremely close, like closer than close, almost combined, at a point of rupture in their friendship. So of course, those were things that, like, the rupture moments, calling your friend a bitch, moving away, sort of refusing to talk about it. Those were things that were highlighted here and sort of embedded in the warmth in it, so you could see both of them happening at once and the heat of both.
Yeah, very well said. Your book introduces this idea of time loops and multiverses, but it's sort of its own spin on these ideas.
Mhm.
So, without giving away too much, can you talk a little bit about where that idea came from that you've come up with?
Yeah,
The logic, I guess, of the book?
yeah, for sure. So initially, when I was thinking about the book, I wanted to write about. I just sometimes I have these creative intuitions that sound really crazy until you dig into them and learn who the people are in them. But I just wanted to write about two best friends reliving the same day over and over in the Louvre, and that I started then thinking about, okay, well, what would that mean? Who would these people be? And why, like, why would it be looping? What would it be? What would that be providing to them as human beings for readers? And I got very interested in the idea of, as I said earlier, I think structure as a plot point in a book. Because I think very often, every book has intentional structure, but it's not always used in a way that is visible to the reader. And so I thought about movies and books that do this already. I mean, obviously, Groundhog Day. I wrote this before Russian Doll came out. I wanted to say that. I love that show. It's beautiful. But we were working on them simultaneously from different angles. So I was thinking about in Groundhog Day, there's Bill Murray's character is aware of what's happening. Every time he lives the day over again, he knows and he's able to learn from it, and he's able to sort of progress from his curmudgeonly character to the heartwarming rom-com hero that he is by the end. And I thought it would what I found interesting about the way that I approach it here is that it was the challenge of making sure it was clear to the reader that the days were repeating without Bertie and Kate actually being consciously aware of it. They have certain intuitions that it is happening, but until farther on in the book, you have no idea why. And that it was important to me also that there be eventually some sort of reason that you can grasp onto for why it's happening, but also that there be multiple reasons, because there are different types of explanation that are offered throughout, especially the second half of the book. And that was fitting to me because it's all about how there really is this sort of two sides of a coin in especially the way Bertie experiences the time loops, that you could either view it as being completely stuck in one place, or you can view it as many opportunities to live your life slightly different ways. So all of those possibilities were important to me. And I do think that you ultimately can view it more as a multiverse than as a loop, just a multiverse where you're sort of stepping backwards and to the side.
Yeah.
Does that help?
Yeah. That was one of my favorite things, is that time for them isn't exactly the same as time for us. So even in the beginning, when we're having this kind of Groundhog Day moment, it's not the same day, because they've already lived that first day. So when they wake up on that day for the second time, their clothing is wrinkled.
Mm-hmm.
And the people around are slightly different.
Yeah. And I wanted there always to be, even when I'm giving clear signals of like, okay, this is something that you've seen happen before, or this is something you've seen, it happens a slightly different way every time, but you can recognize it as a flag. There's also a sense that the characters are progressing as people. So they're not just stuck in the same emotional place. And that becomes an important part of how they experience the time loops, that there is, even though they're not experiencing the kind of emotional growth that Bill Murray is able to, for example, because he's aware of what's happening, they're still being affected by what they have been through.
You described this world that they're living in before as sort of like a sideways version of our world now.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not hard to imagine it being our world in the not too distant future. There are all of these bombings, there's famine, there are natural disasters. And I think you can kind of, unfortunately, extrapolate from where we are in our current world that
Yes.
these are things that could happen. Why did you decide to set it in this kind of world where things are sort of falling apart and maybe ending?
Well, I started writing it in 2017, and that was an escalating feeling that I had about the world. A lot of the things that people I think will naturally bring to the book based on when it's coming out are, the pandemic, quarantine as a time loop, Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine now, but none of that had happened. So it feels a little bit closer to me now than it did even at the time. But I was seeing those things play out. And one of the ways that I approached writing the novel in terms of the details that I chose was that I pulled some of the details more so than usual from my own life, even though obviously it's not an autobiography by any means. None of these things have happened to me. I'm not stuck in a time loop that I'm aware of, but there are some details from various friendships of mine that made their way into the book, and from my life and from my thoughts and from my experiences. So that was a natural part of that process, because I wanted to feel like my life is almost, if you spun Bertie's life off, many, many, many loops more distant than anything that happens in the book. It allowed me to feel this special connective tissue to what was happening in Bertie's world. And then also, I do think that there is a sense that when your internal world is falling apart, it feels like everything is falling apart. And I thought about the movie Melancholia, the Lars von Trier film, where Kirsten Dunst's character in the first half of the movie is just depressed and like ditching her wedding, and you don't really understand why. She's just clinically depressed, basically. And in the second half of the movie, the world ends because another planet smashes into it, and everybody's freaking out. But to her, it's just her internal world reaching equilibrium with the external world. So in a way, the apocalypse is a motif, and it's also an opportunity to explore how it can feel on a day-to-day basis like things are getting so much worse, but they also feel so ordinary that it can be really hard to step outside your routine and your structure and the way that your life, all of the things that make your life seem possible, even when they aren't necessarily great for the world. Or, there are a lot of things I do that aren't like heroic moves, but they are just part of my day-to-day life. And that's another area that I wanted to put pressure on Bertie as in terms of her stuckness and her also just like her feeling of being embedded in her life and not knowing how, like almost not even wanting to get out of the things that are even the ones that are giving her pain, and to show how that has a larger expression in the world because we're all doing it at the same time.
So my last question is this. Why the Louvre?
Well, you did ask at the beginning of the book about my connections to France. And so one answer is that I have that friend who I went to the Louvre with when I was 18. And Bertie and Kate had an idea for a trip like that they didn't actually take, but I got to. So there is a personal connection to me. But maybe more so than that, Bertie's connection to art is very strong and very vexed because she is an artist and she therefore sees how complicated the world of success for artists can be, and how so the Mona Lisa, not surprisingly, becomes a very important touch point within the art world. Not just, so often it's used as just an example of the greatest, the world's greatest art, and to Bertie it's more just an example of the world's most famous art. And that doesn't mean that she thinks it's bad. She actually admires it very much and thinks it's a beautiful painting. But it's an opportunity to think about how opinions around a piece of art or a piece of writing or a piece of film or anything can just collect their own gravity. Like once something gets momentum, it becomes sort of unstoppable. And Bertie is always thinking about why and how that is. And that becomes almost material within the Louvre that they exist in. And I just think that the Louvre is one of the major art centers of the world, and so and especially coming at it from an American standpoint, there are so many people for whom a visit to the Louvre, especially to see the Mona Lisa, maybe only to see the Mona Lisa in some people's cases, is like the pinnacle of their life. It's something that they check off a checklist. And so that was it was like an icon for me. It had to be the Louvre.
Okay. So I have a bonus question for you.
Mm-hmm.
If multiverses are real and you had the chance to meet the different iterations of yourself, would you?
Podcast listeners can't see my face, but it's very much Munch's The Scream.
Yep.
I think I'd want to meet some. Yeah. I don't know, obviously it would, if you were able to meet your alternate versions, you would suddenly be affecting those other versions and affecting the worlds that they live in. So that could be an apocalypse scenario. You have no idea what sort of cascading effect you will have. But I think it would be interesting. There are definitely moments of major choices in my life that I'd be curious to see how they turned out the other way. But there's nothing, I don't have any really large regrets. I look back on most of the times of my life as places that I wouldn't necessarily want to go back to, but that I was happy with at the time, and I'm happy now. And I'm super curious how other happy or unhappy versions of me might look, and just how the world in general might be different in different places. Because I'm a process nerd. I'm an information nerd, which I guess is just a regular nerd. I I love to know things. I'm very curious, so I probably couldn't help myself.
Are you intimidated by French lingerie, or do you see it as a form of self-expression? Either way, you'll be interested in the Paris Undressed podcast. In each episode, host Kate Kemp-Griffin features interviews with lingerie designers, consumers, and experts to go beyond the seams of the lingerie capital of the world. Listen now to Paris Undressed on Paris Underground Radio or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris.
So I think you're going to read an excerpt now from End of the World House. Is there anything that we need to know contextually before you read to us?
Yes. So I am going to read from a section partway into the book, and what you need to know is that at this point, Bertie and Kate have been in the Louvre. Kate has disappeared with someone, and Bertie is not thrilled about it. Bertie's memories were hazy and multiple, overlaying one another until she forced them together and made them stay. Bertie drank a glass of red wine very fast and then ordered a whiskey. Oh, one other contextual point is that she is at an American bar in Paris, like an expat bar. Bertie drank a glass of red wine very fast and then ordered a whiskey. Kate had abandoned her, and here she was. So much for their quiet evening of reading. So much for the end of their grand tour. All her life she'd followed the rules, getting A's on her report card and landing a job that brought in cash. She'd walked the straight and narrow path as if in a game of Candyland, collecting gumdrop after gumdrop with the occasional licorice twist. She'd been nice to Kate almost all the time, and this was what happened. Being nice got you this. But maybe the path hadn't been so straight. Half the whiskey now was gone. Maybe there had been many ways to look at herself from the very beginning, which didn't line so neatly up. Her bar stool, she realized, could spin around, and she spun it now, smiling at the boy seated next to her, to whom she realized she had been talking for some time, describing her confusing evening and telling him, to hell with Kate. Who ditches their best friend on vacation, she asked, slurring just slightly, tilting her chin onto her shoulder to maintain eye contact as she twirled. For a man, who does that? The boy shook his head and frowned, leaning his elbows on the sticky bar. He couldn't have been more than 24, and he wasn't much of a conversationalist, but he was listening to her, and maybe that was enough. He bought her another well whiskey on the rocks and got the bartender to give them a red basket full of salted pretzels. According to the flag patch sewn onto his backpack, he was Australian, although who could say? Wrong bar for Aussies, Bertie said conspiratorially. But don't worry, I won't tell. She took a sip of her drink. Do you know, she said, have you noticed that the world is ending? The boy just gaped. Bertie nodded, feeling sage. And even though the world is, over, people still want everything to be normal. People still want to do a juice cleanse. As she leaned forward to emphasize juice cleanse, the boy leaned back in astonishment, though it was unclear to Bertie if he was reacting to all that immoderate living or just to the fact that Bertie had elbowed over the pretzels, knocking them all across his lap. I just want to, shake their shoulders and say, guys, there's no Florida anymore. The KKK has a hold of Mississippi. The what? Asked the boy, saying his first words to Bertie, or possibly even his very first words of all time. The air shimmered around them. The racists! With the hoods! To which the boy said nothing, but he did adopt a look of grim understanding. He was definitely Australian. He had that accent, like biting a lemon with every word, and he was bronzed all over from surf and sun. Bertie wanted to tell him that the world was not to be relied upon, that the things you trusted would sneak up and sink their teeth into you when you least expected it. But he had so many freckles, and they were so cute, and she kept getting distracted and trying to touch them. Which was harder than it should have been, because he kept looking around for the dropped pretzels, putting them one by one back in the basket. Then he started to eat them. The boy was wearing a probably ironic t-shirt, screen-printed with the words, G'day! Or was that one word? Did it count as a compound if it was technically just misspeaking? She wanted to say again that life as they knew it was over, that friends were not friends and safety was an illusion, but even through the alcoholic fog, she knew how maudlin that would sound. So she bent over and kissed the boy instead, hard on the mouth, and he accepted it, with the same gallantry he'd accepted everything, except perhaps spilling the pretzels. They made out for a little while in the bathroom, which was wood-paneled and covered with scratched-on graffiti. It felt good at first. His warm chest, the uneducated roving of his hands. Bertie hitched up her t-shirt, bringing his palms in contact with her skin, and the boy responded by unzipping his pants, an idea about which Bertie shared his enthusiasm. Around them, the words of the past occupants screamed in all caps, entreating them to call Zoe, she's a bitch, and announcing, Eiffel Tower, joie de vivre! And Bertie considered, why not joie, given vivre? Why not live just a little bit? She made a sudden turn and banged her head against the stall door, cartoon stars emerging before her eyes as cartoon birds tweeted above her. Or maybe she was imagining those? And she simultaneously smacked her elbow into the empty toilet paper dispenser. The boy took this opportunity to put his hands on both of her breasts, and with her funny bone zinging electric within her, she chased him away, catching just enough relief on his face to be furious at him. Because how dare he, after all, think he knew better than she did how embarrassing this all was? Those rules she'd followed, what good had they done her? What good did they do anyone? Her parents had been supposed to live into a very old age. They had both stopped eating red meat and avoided everything unsavory on the internet. They liked Clark Gable movies and ingenious new productions of Fiddler on the Roof that made use of found objects for the prop list and offered costume styling somewhere between David Bowie and the board game Settlers of Catan. They did everything right, and if life was indeed a game of Candyland, then they had fallen into a molasses swamp, one of those random calamities that games were full of if you made the wrong roll of the dice. It sounded cute, but it wasn't. You'd drown in molasses, a painful death. The sticky substance would pour down your throat and fill your lungs like sweet pneumonia, taking with it even the dignity of a final breath. Somehow, Bertie ended up back at the hotel. The boy was gone. Without closing the curtains, but also without turning on the lights, she took off all her clothes and got under the covers naked, still grumbling to herself about the burned-up fields in Kansas and about how Venice was finally, for good and ever, sinking into the sea. Although this last was mostly conjecture based on satellite imagery, since Italy was one of the few European Union countries that hadn't yet opened back up its borders. Otherwise, Bertie and Kate might have gone to the Cinque Terre in order to sunbathe by the sea. Their choices would have been different. Their path forked. The world was unwell, but was anyone talking about it? No, not enough. They were quietly renovating fancy museums and sneaking around to have sex with dubious Frenchmen. As she closed her eyes, Bertie felt her anger melt into a vast and hollow fear, familiar from childhood and bad hangovers. The sense of tipping over into a void, standing at the edge of a cliff and leaning past the guardrail a little too far. Or more specifically, of lying flat and still in bed as the room spun around her. She fell asleep with a heater breathing onto her face, troubling her hair, too tired to move out of the way. Alcohol burning off her in a fever and leaving nothing behind except a smell of acid sweet. In her dreams, she and Kate ended up at the museum again. She was wearing the same dirty jeans, but every time Kate had on a different outfit, each one nicer than the last. There was the time that the floor was covered in several inches of water, so their feet got cold and blistery as they wandered through the wings. The time the Venus de Milo had grown new arms, and they couldn't agree if it was even the right statue, despite the label on the wall. The time they saw Javier walking through a door marked Staff Only, Passage Interdit, and banged to be let in, though he never seemed to hear. Kate wore a black silk blouse with puffed sleeves, a crepe dress with gold sundials all over it, a pair of shoes that were hot pink with 2-inch soles which made her look like a delivery girl for a demigod, blessed with feet that could go the distance. In one dream, Kate woke up in bed and sniffed the air as she threw off the covers. She said to Bertie, "Do you ever think to yourself, my body smells like a roast chicken and I just love it?" They didn't feel like dreams. Instead, they felt real. The walk down the curving staircase to the hotel lobby, the breakfasts all different but also the same. A crumb stuck to the lip, a bitter coffee ground lingering on the tongue. But it also felt real when Bertie woke up 3 different times in 3 different dream places, always having to pee. "You're awake," she told herself, straining against her bladder. "This time you're really awake." But she never was until the last possible moment when she ran to the bathroom and was finally relieved. Periodically, as she tossed and turned, Bertie became convinced she heard breathing and that there was someone else in the room. But when she looked, the other bed was empty, the corners tucked tight. All night, moonlight spilled through the window onto Kate's pillow, and no matter how many times Bertie checked, it remained pristine.
I love that chapter. Thank you.
Thank you. I love it too.
So this episode will come out on April 13th. Can you remind me when your book comes out?
April 19th, so that's great.
Perfect. So how can people find your book?
It should be available anywhere books are sold, and even if you go into a bookstore and they don't have it, you can always ask them to order it. And it's coming out from Simon & Schuster, so if you go to their website, you can find it there, or my website, adriennecelt.com, also has pre-order links, and they will become just order links, I guess. So yeah, anywhere you like to get books, you should be able to get it.
Perfect. And what's next for you? Can we expect another book?
Yeah, I'm working on something new now. I'm working on it a little slowly, and I'm working on a bunch of cartoons. So watch this space, I guess. And I'm really interested to see how the Invitation to a Bonfire TV show turns out. So I'm going to get to talk to the showrunner for that pretty soon. And so hopefully I'll know some secret details about casting that I don't know yet, unfortunately.
So it's in pre-production now.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. And where can people find you if they want to keep up to date with your books and your TV shows and whatever else is next?
Well, you can always find me on Twitter way too often. So I'm at Celt Adri, which was my college email address that for some reason I still use for everything. So that's CELTADRI. And that's also my Instagram handle and my Tumblr. So I still have a Tumblr. And so those are great places. I have a tiny letter. That's tinyletter.com/celtadri. I send out the weekly comic that I draw and also a little, like blog post sort of. And if you just want to find those for yourself, you can find them at loveamongthelampries.com or on my Tumblr. So I'm basically all over the internet, way more than I should be.
Excellent. And I'll put links in for everything so people can find you.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you again to Adrienne Celt for such a compelling conversation. You can find Adrienne on her website, adriennecelt.com, on socials at CeltAdri, and her comics on loveamongthelampries.com. End of the World House will be out on April 19th through Simon & Schuster and is available wherever books are sold. Please join me next week when my guest will be award-winning author Kirsty Manning. Check back next week to see if your questions have been answered and to hear a reading from her book, The French Gift. Thank you for listening to Storytime in Paris. If you like this episode, please consider leaving a rating or review and subscribe so you never miss an episode. If you'd like to take a deeper dive into the books featured on this podcast, join our book club. Each month, we'll be joined via Zoom by an author I've interviewed on this podcast to learn even more about them and their work. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity, and you can find me on all socials at Jennyphoria, that's JennyPhoria, and on my website, jennyphoria.com. Storytime in Paris is produced by me as part of the Paris Underground Radio podcast network. To check out interviews with previous guests or to discover more great Paris-based podcasts, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. This episode of Don't Miss This was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.